There's no sound to it. It doesn't amplify anything, but they record it through these, so you have to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here at the Free Peoples of Russia House. And today we have Ambassador Herbst, and I'm sure Michael will introduce him. I would just extend my gratitude for you being here and for being part of this event. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
So I'll say two biographical words. Ambassador Herbst was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. He's now head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Did I get that correct? And is one of the foremost experts in the United States, in the world, on all things Russia and Ukraine. And is here today to talk about the potential end to the war, whatever that may look like. And just to get us started, I want to read one 3-sentence summary of the situation, and I want to get your reaction to it. So it goes like this. The Russian side is, and that's the problem. They have not really done anything in the past several years to try to bring about peace and security. And they seek to continue to blame Ukraine for that. Remember that this conflict is happening inside Ukrainian territory. It's not Ukraine inside Russia, it's Russia inside Ukrainian territory. I think the Russians have apparently decided that they're not going to be making new efforts for peace right now. I want to get your reaction to that.
That's right. It's that simple. But of course, that's an accurate picture of part of the equation.
What's it missing?
It's missing the context for that. So what is driving? Obviously, it is Russian policy, but it's Russian policy because it's Putin's policy. It's very controversial in Ukraine to say this is Putin's war, because this dredges up literally centuries of memories of Russians repressing Ukrainians. But if you try to look closely at how this war originated, this was a Putin special. And especially the large invasion was a Putin special. To me, there's substantial, by Kremlinologists' standards, substantial evidence for what I've just said. And that evidence takes us back to a few days before the big invasion and the week or two after it. I forget how many days precisely it was before the big invasion. I think it was the Monday before the Thursday launch of the invasion. You had that really interesting video of Putin meeting with his national security advisors.
February 21st, it was Monday before the Thursday. You're right about that.
To talk about policy towards Ukraine. And it was very clear from that he was going to go in. That the 100,000 plus Russian troops on Ukraine, scattered around Ukraine's borders, which of course was a very serious military mistake, were going to go in. And the amazing thing, this was shown to the entire world, Putin's talking about this, and everybody's glum, right? No one's going, yeah, boss, we're going to show him. And Putin felt he had to deal with that in a way you would expect a strong man to do, and I put strong man in quotes, or say as an archetype in political science, by kind of reaming out Narishkin, right, his foreign intelligence guy. And that was a way not just to show who's in charge, but to show what was in charge, that this is the agenda. And we Russians have to rally behind it. But that was not a show of Putin's closest advisors, again, on security issues, rallying to the cause. And just to underscore this point, you had the equally unusual video. I would guess it was the Saturday following the Thursday. It was a day or 2 or 3 after the big invasion began. There's Putin talking to his defense minister, Shoigu, and his top military guy, Gerasimov, who's still in that job, which is a whole story in itself. And he's saying, you know, this is a dangerous situation. We're going to have to go on nuclear alert.
It was February 27th, 3 days after, Sunday, yeah.
And no, neither Shoigu nor Gerasimov were saying, yeah, boss, we're going to show him. No, they also were kind of dour, or dour, however you pronounce that word. So this is clearly not something even the National Security Elite was behind. And just to further present the evidence, roughly for 10 days following the big invasion, we saw demonstrations across the length of Russia, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators against this special military operation. We had, I think, letters that became public from at least several, if not more than several, oligarchs saying, not the best thing, or at least expressing worry about what this would mean for their interests. And in some ways, the most interesting, you had more than a handful of my Russian counterparts writing, this ain't so good. I say roughly 10 days. Then Putin brought the hammer down. The demonstrators were arrested. The oligarchs shut up. And the think tankers hopped too. Because they were afraid. One last point on this theme. We saw evidence for this also when they decided they needed a quote-unquote partial mobilization. This was the fall of 22, and the timing was not coincidental. When they began to mobilize forcibly, Ukraine had just completed this completely unexpected, at least to the Russians, and for that matter to the Biden administration, and to the U.S. intelligence community, a truly effective counteroffensive. So Putin realized he needed more bodies. So what do? Quote unquote, a partial mobilization. This was criticized audibly, even though the hammer had come down 6 months earlier, to the extent that senior Russian politicians tried to distance themselves from this, because it was unpopular. So, and of course, the estimates range from like 700,000 to 1.5 million draft age or mobilization aged Russian men heading for the hills of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and so on. Well, I mean, maybe at the hills in Central Asia. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Russian people marched to the sound of the guns. They sure weren't marching to the sounds of guns when Putin invaded Ukraine.
Ukrainians were, though.
Yes, not just Ukrainians. Ethnic Russian Ukrainian citizens, virtually everyone in Donbass, where 90% are Russian speakers, whether or not they're Ukrainian or Russian ethnically. And by the way, in Donbass, the actual ethnic Russian population was, this is before the big invasion, like 23%. Never a majority, as people speak. But in any case, culturally and linguistically, part of Russia world, those Ukrainians in Donbass before the big invasion, not after. Talking outside, before I came in here, I mentioned I was ambassador during the Orange Revolution. When I got to Moscow, when I got to Kiev in September of '03, Putin was easily the most popular politician in Ukraine. Once someone becomes president of Ukraine, within 6 or 8 months, their poll ratings tank. Putin had 60+% approval rating amongst Ukrainians. As a result of his shenanigans before and during the Orange Revolution, he never had the west of the country. But because of those shenanigans when I was there, he lost the center of the country, meaning like Kiev, Dnipro, moving north, my goodness, Chernihiv. But it took first the war in 14, where he lost Donbass, and then the big invasion where he lost the South too. So his approval ratings are now in the 4 or 3% range.
2004, when Yanukovych was running to succeed Kuchma, Putin and Medvedev came to Kiev, and they actually appeared at a military parade.
He came 3 times.
Yeah.
In 3 months.
Yeah.
Yes.
He went on television. I don't remember whose channel it was, but
Most of the channels were controlled by people who were not interested in a fair election.
right. But channel number 5 was interested in a fair election. He was not on that one.
channel.
Yeah. When he was taking questions from Ukrainian journalists, one of the things that he talked about was Russia shouldn't be interfering in Ukraine's political affairs because that kind of interference from the outside could have the opposite effect of what's intended. Of course, he's on the dais at the military parade with Medvedchuk and Yanukovych and Kuchma and Medvedev, but he was not coming out with this message that you should vote for me. And his presence was certainly not enough to get Yanukovych elected.
Right.
Did he understand that he was not decisively popular in Ukraine at that point?
I would not say that at the time he appeared, and the first appearance in the pre-election period was in August. That was on Ukrainian Independence Day. He was a very popular figure at that point. But the fact that he was popular even then, before, basically it was by the end of the Orange Revolution, he was no longer popular in the center. That did not necessarily translate into Ukrainians buying his endorsements. I mean, that's the whole thing about Ukrainian culture. In Russian culture, or I should say Russian political culture, they see themselves as rallying to their leadership, however imperfect it is. They may be cynical about their leadership, but even that cynicism does not lead them to mobilize actively against it.
Are Ukrainians so different? When I got to Ukraine during the full-scale war, I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer before. I had known Ukraine. But July of 2022, I talked to a whole lot of soldiers and volunteers who said, we can't stand Zelensky. We want to beat the Russians so that then we can go to Kiev.
That's exactly.
And Ukrainians rallied, not around their leader, though.
No, they rallied to the nation. Yeah. It's that simple. You just underscored my point. Ukrainian political culture evolved as a largish group surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbors. Yes, Muscovy, right? We go back to the 16th, 17th century before we began to talk about Russia, but also the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom to the northeast of Moscow. And if you're familiar with the history, you know that those two political entities fought for control of their region. And a lot of that fighting was in historical Ukraine. And then also to the south, you had the Ottoman Empire. And to the immediate west, you had the Austrian Empire. So Ukraine was always pulled and pushed amongst these 4 powers and not treated nicely by any of them. Although I don't want to, people don't treat each other nations nicely. That's not so unusual. But because they were largely at the largely controlled by these other powers, and no one had complete control over Ukrainian land. All the 4 powers I just mentioned controlled portions of it. they developed sort of the smart alecky political culture of trying to figure a way to fool, since they couldn't beat outside power. And because I have a smart alecky personality, I like to point to things that in an easy way demonstrate the point. Understanding the difference between Russian and Ukrainian political culture, all you need to look at is the work of the painter, my goodness, I'm forgetting his name. He painted in the late 19th century. He's the one who painted the famous picture of the Zaporizhia Cossacks writing to the Ottoman Emperor.
I can see the painting. I can't remember who it is. Who is it? It's not Repin.
I was going to say Rublev, but he's, of course, the icon painter. Sorry? No, Voznitsov, great painter, same period, but not the same guy. Repin, yes.
Repin? Okay, I was.
Дякую, спасибо. Repin. So for the Ukrainian culture, it's the Zaporizhia Cossacks telling off the emperor. They're writing a letter to him telling him to stuff it. And then for Russian culture, you could accuse either the Volga boatmen, you know the picture I'm talking about? The Volga boatmen.
Slaves pulling a ship.
Right, along the Volga River, or the famous picture of Ivan the Terrible embracing his son whom he just murdered. So you might say the not easy acquiescence or loyalty to a tough guy in charge. Those are clearly distinct cultures.
So 2004, Yanukovych loses the election via a popular demonstration, which lasts for months and occupies central Kiev. After Putin has campaigned for Yanukovych, Yanukovych does win a free and fair election in 2010. And then by 2014, he's overthrown by another popular revolution. Russia illegally annexes Crimea. They start the war in the Donbass. It doesn't go well. They manage to get into Donetsk and Lugansk, but there's a pretty massive volunteer movement which rises up in Ukraine and prevents Russian-backed and active-duty Russian soldiers from getting any further. Does Putin understand at this point that he's not a popular figure in Ukraine?
I don't know the answer to that, but he realized that military force was not getting done what he wanted done. And he realized that his initial reliance on all those supposed pro-Russian Ukrainian citizens in the east and the south wasn't doing it. It's worth recalling here that an influential player in Russia's imperial ambitions, first in Crimea and then in Donbass, was the soldier of fortune, actually that's not correct, former FSB Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel Igor Strelkov, said he was the quote-unquote defense minister of the Donetsk People's Republic in those first months of the Russian war on Ukraine in 2014. He said, we don't have people rallying to us. We need Russians to come in. So they understood it, which is why as Poroshenko was elected in May of 14, right? The seizure of Crimea was February. The Russian offensive in Donbass began in early April of 14. Poroshenko was elected middle of May, or maybe a little bit earlier than that. He takes office late-ish May. He immediately starts a counteroffensive, which pushes the Russians back from western Donbass to eastern Donbass. And had the Red Army, regular Russian forces, not intervened, starting in mid to late August, the Ukrainians would have taken back the entire Donbass. And then the Russians won big, early September, I'm forgetting the name of the town right now, and you had basically the situation that existed until the big invasion.
Ilovaisk.
Yeah.
Ilovaisk, which is between the city of Donetsk and the Russian border.
Right.
So the Ukrainians were actually coming in to cut off Donetsk from mainland Russia.
Right. And while I left Ukraine as a U.S. diplomat in June of 06 and only returned in June of 14, I spoke with a lot of people in the East shortly after the period we're describing. And I was basically told the Russians got their foothold in Donetsk because they had proper intelligence, so they knew where the municipal centers were. And of course, that they had proper intelligence because they had suborned people in the SBU, Ukrainian Secret Service, and the police. But they didn't have such good intel in Kharkiv. So they grabbed a theater. They thought they were grabbing the municipality. They grabbed a theater which gave time for locals to react. And their reaction prevented the Russians from gaining control of the city. And by the time Russian forces began to arrive from Russia, forces had arrived from Kiev.
So we're talking 2014.
Right.
I did not plan to do this, but the opening question that I asked was about the situation on the ground, which I described. Russian side basically not prepared to move. That's the problem. Conflict on Ukrainian territory. It was kind of a trick question because the quote is from Kurt Volker on September 12th, 2018, describing dynamics in that Donbass war, which started in 2014, was very hot in August 2014, January, February 2015, and then settled down quite a bit, but still remained active. So Volker was Trump's special representative in talks around that conflict, meeting with Surkov, in the late 2010s, and describing a situation which is remarkably similar to what we see on the ground now in Ukraine. Of course, it was on a much lower level in 2018, but the overall dynamics are basically there. And to bring us closer to the present, this is 7 years ago, and his quote, not perfectly, but pretty well describes the situation we see today. What needs to happen so that in 2032, 7 years from now, this quote will not accurately describe the situation between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, first, the situation Kurt described 7 years ago could last ad infinitum because the impact of the war on either Russia or Ukraine then was significantly less than it is today. I've been saying since 2014 and even since 2022 that this war was probably going to last a long time. But while it was easy to say with some confidence in 2014, or for that matter in 2019, that the war could last for a decade or more, Russia created by this large war. The alternative for them is being wiped out as an independent people, and perhaps even wiped out as a people, because those filtration camps that I referred to earlier, or concentration camps, which is what they are designed to test the loyalty to an order in Ukraine run by Moscow, or to treat as a hostile figure those who don't accept it. And Ukrainians understand that. The senior official in Kherson at the time of the Russian big invasion was taken prisoner early on and was released in some prisoner exchange, I think, several months after that. Told me, well, see, this is now 25, so this would have been 3 years ago, the fall of 22, that it's unpleasant to live under Russian bombing, but far worse to live under Russian occupation.
This is my phrase. Ukrainians do not have a choice between war and peace. They have a choice between war and Bucha.
Yes, it's a good line. I like it.
Thank you.
I will use it and quote you.
Feel free. So if Ukraine doesn't actually have the option of bringing this to an end, who does? Who makes the decision about when this war ends?
Well, Ukraine does have some agency in bringing this war to an end, and that's by conducting brilliant military operations which only increase the cost to Moscow of its aggression in Ukraine. And we have seen that in multiple ways, whether it's driving the Black Sea Fleet into the eastern portion of the Black Sea, or even the Sea of Azov, whether it's taking out as much as 38%, maybe certainly 20%, but as much as 38% of Moscow's hydrocarbon production, or taking out 1/3 or more of Russia's strategic bombers, and imposing an extraordinary human and equipment cost on Moscow's tiny territorial gains along the front. And just to stress how this is important beyond the battlefield, there was one witless member, and I'll be polite not naming the person, of Trump world, who, when the Ukrainians launched effectively Operation Spiderweb, said this is an unacceptable Ukrainian escalation. And we all know that Trump's reaction, well, no, this is badass. So they got his admiration and respect with that operation. So all of these things are Ukraine's contribution. And they have placed great pressure on Moscow. I don't understand, except with the explanation that there could be some real stupidity in the Kremlin, why Moscow continues these extraordinarily costly, in human lives and equipment, kamikaze attacks along the line. I mean, I think the answer is because his generals are telling him this is successful and they're making gains, painful, but still they're making gains. But there are others who have agency, and here's where the United States is especially important, but also Europe and its various guises, whether it's the EU, whether it's individual countries. I think that ultimately Putin's position is more perilous than Zelensky's. And this comes back to something we started with, which is the Ukrainian people are all in for reasons you've laid out, as have I. Whereas the Russian people are not all in because they understand this is not a war, it's not an existential war, it's not a war even that's good for Russia. So in that sense, Zelensky has the support of his population, which Putin really doesn't have, although it's Russia, so they're not going to be demonstrating against him because it's dangerous for their health. If we make sure not just that Ukraine can continue to impose serious costs on Russian aggression in Ukraine, but that Ukraine can make sure that Putin cannot gain one more millimeter of Russian territory, that gives Putin reason to think maybe he needs to stop the war. But then also, Putin has two vulnerabilities where the U.S. has substantial ability to influence his calculation. One is, again, on weapons to stop any Russian movement forward. And two is to increase the economic cost of this war. And this is where the step that the administration took earlier this week is very important. And, of course, there's a lot more that can be done.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay, good.
I want to step back to one more quote.
All right.
Putin's game is really to intimidate us, the United States, into stopping our support for Ukraine. And so we should respond by sending Ukraine all the weapons they need, along with the economic support to sustain themselves for as long as Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian territory.
Okay.
Unequivocally right, yeah?
Well, I don't disagree with that. But I realize I'm just a former diplomat and a think tanker. I'm not the President of the United States. So we have to take into account the views of the man who the American people elected. And his views overlap with part of the sentiment expressed there, but only part, right?
How closely did the Biden administration sentiments overlap with that?
It's so sad to talk about this.
Can I?
What?
If the Biden administration were not so timid in sending more advanced weapons, then the odds of a major Ukrainian battlefield success would have been higher. But the administration, this is talking about Biden, has been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats.
That sounds like something I might have said.
It was. The first one actually you said to me.
That was not set up, folks, by the way.
Not completely. But I had the advantage of having interviewed Ambassador Herbst a couple of times when I was working for Newsweek. The first quote about Putin's game is really to intimidate us. That's November 3rd, 2022. The one about the Biden administration has been too timid in sending weapons, that's May 5th, 2023.
I was actually kind to the Biden administration, although they would never acknowledge it. I use the word timidity as opposed to weakness because I didn't want to completely close all channels with them. But the reason why I said that when you ask about the Biden administration, it's sad, it's for the following reason. Biden understood the stakes in this war. He understood that a Russian victory in Ukraine was very dangerous to us, that Putin's ambitions went beyond Ukraine, and he actually said that kind of a couple of times. He said it first after, this was in like late November, early December of 23, after the Hamas attack on Israel, because he gave he actually wrote an op-ed and spoke from the Oval Office at that time and laid out almost as clearly as I was laying out at the time. And he did it again at the top of the State of the Union in whatever that was, late January, early February of 24. But he was scared of Putin's nuclear threats. And that's just a sad, sad state of affairs. And he did not hide that, let's just say, caution. I'll return to be polite for a minute. And because he made this point publicly, and you know, I'm a child of the Cold War. I became interested in international affairs, sort of a add-on to natural boy's interest in war in the mid to late 1960s in junior high school and high school. And I can tell you from that time on, I paid a lot of attention to this. And not once before Biden did an American president ever say in a confrontation with a nuclear power, and of course, when I was younger, that was the Soviet Union, we can't do X or Y or Z because they may nuke us. Obviously, in the sit room, we looked at this very carefully behind closed doors, and we had to look at this, gauge carefully what was going on, but we never folded prematurely because the other guy was talking nukes. That tells the other guys, you can get what you want against American interests by threatening the United States. Very, very bad luck. And his whole team went along with this. And you see a lot of efforts now for them to recoup their image, but they don't bear scrutiny. So they should have done the right thing. Biden understood the state, which in some ways he was, but ultimately he did not have the backbone to be the president of the United States. And his team, made up of smart guys, who had been perfect serving as the foreign minister in Austria or in Uganda,
Yep.
but not of the world's premier superpower. And their public utterances meant that all the cognoscenti, the foreign policy experts, were echoing that. So I've spoken with many prominent people in that period who Johnson. He had been a Democrat. He was a public intellectual and a Democrat political operative. And he used to say, you know, he was talking about China in one of his columns. He said, you know, the mob squad in the New York Police Department can tell you a lot more about what's going on in Beijing than all the China scholars scattered throughout applies. Intimidated the way Biden was. If you want me to get to that,
We're going to.
okay. Uh, threatening nukes, and Biden should, ever since nukes became something in this war. Or over Romania? Is it easier for us to confront him in Lithuania and Poland or in Ukraine? And the answer to those questions are obvious, and they tell you what to do. You don't reduce the possibility of a nuclear confrontation by letting an aggressive nuclear power achieve its aims by intimidation. Because you may think, I can give up Ukraine, but at some point you're going to have to say no. And this is the place to say no. And they didn't have the wit to see it because they didn't have the spine, the steel to reach this conclusion. Now, Trump, I'll jump to this now. I have had some differences. I mean, I actually made what was turned out to be a tactical mistake of signing a public letter against Trump in September of 16 because of what he was saying about NATO. And of course, many statements he's made about Russia and Ukraine over the years are not wonderful. But I understood by the spring of 24 that he was not going to abandon Ukraine. And I won't get into that now. But on the nuclear issue, he has told the Russians, go stuff it. When Medvedev began to play the new card in the summer, Trump slammed him and sent American submarines closer to the Russian, nuclear submarines closer to the Russian border.
Do we know if they moved in that direction or was it just rhetoric?
I can't say for sure, but the game is all in the rhetoric, to be honest. And then we saw it again just in the last week, right? Putin clearly concerned of what happened after his phone call, on Thursday of last week, right, the coming down of sanctions, decided he needed to play his nuclear hand. And Trump not only saw his hand, but raised him. And that was exactly the right step.
Raised him how?
Wisdom how?
Raised him how? What did he put on the table?
Our nuclear tests.
Okay, more rhetoric.
Well, correct. We have to see the nuclear tests happen. I'll credit him with the rhetoric, but he actually has to follow through now, because this has importance not just with Russia but also with China.
I'm gonna free you up.
By the way, proof that this is the right course is the Russian reaction to this news. Oh, we're not testing nukes; we're just testing missiles.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to free you up politically a little bit, because you have a serious position, and we are being recorded. If you were president, what would you do in order to pressure Putin to the point that he would actually decide to stop fighting in Ukraine?
Okay, let's start with the notion it's possible we will not be able to achieve that specific goal. Maybe he won't stop. Maybe he has to be stopped. But I think there is a reasonable chance for him to change his mind if we make the pressure of continuing the war truly overwhelming. And again, we know the two basic lines of activity: increasing economic sanctions on Russia and increasing support for Ukraine. And that support is first and foremost more sophisticated, more consequential weapons. And right now, the weapon in choice is Tomahawks, but that's not the only thing. And also, as part of that support, let's take care of these frozen Russian assets and get them into Ukrainian hands. If we were to do all these things, okay, we just put down some serious sanctions, and in 5 weeks, if there's not any progress towards a peace, and there won't be, we put down more sanctions. We announce very soon if Russia does not stop attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and Ukrainian cities, we're going to send 10 Tomahawks to Ukraine. And if they do it again after that, it's going to be 40 Tomahawks to Ukraine. And more important than this, it's not just about Tomahawks. We should be in very close contact with the Ukrainians about what will make it impossible for Russia to gain any more territory. What would they need? And we help them get that. If we do this consistently for a minimum of 6 months, but maybe it's going to take 12 or 18, Putin may decide, yeah, things are too hard. He hasn't gained any territory. Inflation in Russia, which appears supposedly at 9%, it's probably a lot more than that, is officially at 18%. Interest rates are at 30%. You understand. The Russian economy, which is already under strain, is under more strain. He may decide, okay, the war is enough. I have to stop where I am right now. Because Trump has offered him, in such circumstances, sweetheart terms. Again, if I had 50.2% of the American public voting for me as president, we would help Ukraine regain all of its territory. Trump's goal is not that. It's to attain a durable peace, which, while not a wonderful outcome, is not bad, good enough for government work. And under the circumstance just described, that deal, which enables Putin to hold on to what he currently holds, albeit de facto, not recognized by law, not recognized by the United States, not a bad deal.
Before we open this up, I'm going to ask one more question, and it's the one that Arseny Yatsenyuk didn't answer 2 weeks ago when I asked it.
He dared not to answer you?
He did. I don't know how that happened. He's the first person who's ever done that. For close to 4 years now, I've been hearing that Ukraine will be able to win the war if, and Russia will be persuaded to stop fighting if. And, you know, every 6 months there's a new set of ifs, and they never come together. When do you expect that constellation of ifs to form, which actually brings an end to this war?
I can't answer that question, but I'll tell you why. If Western policy was truly wise and truly strong, the things I've already described would be underway. In other words, more sanctions coming, more weapons coming, the frozen Russian state assets heading towards Ukraine. If all those things happen, pressure on the Kremlin goes way up, and conceivably, for reasons I've already explained, Putin may decide to end the fighting. But we see, I would say, a C+ effort by the combined Western world to do these things. If suddenly, or even not so suddenly, if over 8 months or 12 months or 24 months, all these things are put into play, then I could see the war ending either by Putin deciding to make peace or ultimately his project coming apart within Russia. And that would be overwhelming economic problems.
For the record, I'll say I expect that the little summary I read at the beginning, the Russian side is basically not prepared to move, and that's the problem, yada, 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 yada. In 7 years, that will still summarize the situation. That's my expectation.
Well, again, if Western policy proceeds along the lines we've just described, I think that's not unreasonable. But it has to, I have to add one more if factor here. I suspect, Ukraine will continue to fight till the end, whatever that end is. And so probably what you've described, and that's probably, conceivably what you described could be the situation. But I suspect the pressures, more on the Russian side, but perhaps also on the Ukrainian side, could lead to a crack in that 7-year period.
I hope we're not here in 7 years, or I hope we are discussing something completely different and not this.
Right. Russia's democratic future and Ukraine's prospering economy.
Exactly.
And membership in NATO.
We are opening this up to questions, but because Ilya Ponomaryov runs the House, he gets the first.
Okay. Where is he?
Ukraine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. although he was here 2 weeks ago, and Arseniy Yatsenyuk did not answer this question, which is why he asked me to ask it. We're talking here about ending the war in Ukraine. And as much as I wish to see that happen, my question is, do you think an end to the war in Ukraine might actually increase the chances of war in Eastern Europe, or would it decrease them?
Some of my colleagues in the think tank community who, having been taught about Russia's natural, I put natural in quotation marks, sway in its neighborhood, argue that Putin's about as good as we're going to get in terms of our interests for a Russian leader. I'm not disputing that there could be figures worse than Putin running the Kremlin. I mean, I pay a lot of attention because I think he's interesting and he provides insights to Gierkin Strelkov. But I suspect the chances of a Gierkin Strelkov, who we all know has been in jail now for like 2 years, becoming a post-Putin president to be extremely unlikely. There is a pattern in Russian history that when they have a splendid little war that doesn't turn out so well, there's a period of chaos and or reform that follows. And I think that pattern is likely, but not definitively, to hold here. All right? If you accept what I've just said, then obviously Ukraine wins the war. We don't worry about a war in Eastern Europe, a Kremlin-instigated war in Eastern Europe. But there's another factor, too, beyond this historical reference. We know Ukrainians have beat the hell out of the Russian conventional army. And for that matter, we know their Air Force, not to mention their Navy. So across the board, Russia, we know, is basically rebuilding that conventional force every year, but at serious economic cost. So having lost the Ukrainian war, is there going to be a leadership in place that's going to prioritize additional economic pain so they could try, having lost to Ukraine, to challenge NATO? Not impossible, but highly unlikely.
Agreed. Anybody have a question?
And by the way, one more thing. You know, they were threatening nukes over Sweden and Finland joining NATO, right? What happened?
Ooh, sorry. I got to jump back to one more thing. I'll find it. It's here. It's worth it, I promise. This is from January 2022. Putin has a dilemma. He's threatening military action unless his unacceptable terms are accepted. But he also worries that the United States, NATO, and the EU would respond to such military action with punishing sanctions, more weapons to Ukraine, and strengthening of NATO forces along the border with Russia. He also has to worry. If he goes into Ukraine, both Finland and Sweden may well choose to join NATO. That's John Herbst, January 24th, 2022. We'll open it up.
My voice has been known to boom, but I'll try not to blast away here. Well, first off, great presentation, great insights, great questions, Michael, and all of this work together. The insights you had about Trump and his view of the nuclear threat, I think, are spot on and really kind of portrays Trump in a different light, because I think a lot of people think that Trump a little bit by Putin, or a lot.
The majority of Americans think that.
Yes, yes. And because clearly Trump has made it clear he's been trying, he wants a deal. And part of my theory, and I get your, is one of the reasons that Trump was trying to get the sweetheart deal for Putin is Trump is not all about freedom for Ukraine per se. He's not against it, but he's more wanting a deal with Putin, a business deal, a trade deal, that he could tout. And in that scenario, Ukraine would be fine, and Putin would get his trade deal. But Putin is really what, in my view, Trump doesn't get about Putin, is that Putin isn't interested in that. So,
Okay, first, I'm glad you asked this question because perhaps I need to clarify something. I don't think that the deal Trump put on the table was a sweetheart deal for Putin. My point was that if we were helping Ukraine kick the Russians back and putting massive pressure on their economy, then for Putin that's a good deal because he at least locks in something. That's all I meant by that. You're right that Trump thought he could make a deal with Putin, and he was interested in cooperation in a post-war period that was unrealistic because Russia doesn't have that much to offer us. I mean, in fact, if they had a government that knew how to develop its economy, yes, but they have a government which runs on rents and by corruption. And Russia's extraordinary natural resources are not really in play, except through their control. So possibilities for our economic prosperity by a cooperation with a Putin-led Russia or something similar are small. Okay, but Trump considers himself a strong man, and a strong man does not cave into threats. And here's an interesting point. The Biden, oh no, nuclear war could come to us, was happily adopted, embraced in Trump world before the election. And you could still hear echoes of it in Trump world since Trump took over. And that includes some prominent people who are currently in the Trump administration, and I will not name them. But obviously they can't say that anymore because their leader is smarter on this than they are.
You talking about a former congressman from Hawaii?
Well, that's one, but there are others, and one formerly very prominent Fox broadcaster.
Yeah.
if I could do a follow-up, just to further, I appreciate you. Yeah, because I think the sweetheart deal reference was, like I said, more perception than the reality there, because Trump wanted a deal, and that's what he thought would get Putin to cut the deal. But what I have heard, and I monitor all kinds of things about this, and I monitor the British, so Michael Clark and people like that he actually is pretty good, I think. But some of the things I've seen they interviewed one time a former Putin speechwriter, and he's now in exile, of course, but can't remember his name. And, but anyway, he mentioned that speechwriter mentioned that there were oil deals with oil companies that were in the works, and that Wickoff was actually involved in those kind of discussions. So that's the kind of deal that I think might have been Trump saying.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that as well. You're right that there was lots of, I'll say speculation, for want of clear evidence publicly available, that Witkoff and others in the Trump administration were looking at possible U.S.-Russian oil and natural gas deals. And we know that there were people close to Trump world with access to players in Trump world who were trying to buy Nord Stream 2 for future use. But here's an interesting thing, and I actually said this a few times publicly, but this never became a huge issue because basically those rumors, those stories stopped sometime in the mid to late spring. Those things directly contradicted Trump policy of drill, baby, drill. Because if you restore Russian gas and oil to the European market, you're taking away an American market. And Trump talked about this during the campaign and after. So that doesn't mean that ultimately a bad deal could have been worked out with someone in Trump world. But had it actually gotten some traction and became a possible reality that we all saw, the point I just made would have come back to hit whoever was pushing that very hard. And on Nord Stream 2, I remember there was at least a story or two saying that members of the Trump family were looking at this, but decided it was too hot to handle, which would underscore the the analysis I just made.
Great. Again, great insights. Thank you.
Mr. Herbst, thank you for such thoughtful presentation. My name is Anton. I'm at GW University. And I actually have two questions. First is, why has Russia managed to keep fighting and absorb tough sanctions better than many expected? Also, how does the United States ideally want Russia to evolve? As a democratic partner, content competitor, or simply a predictable great power? And what would make this vision realistic? What do you think?
Okay. Again, the first question was?
Why Russia, what's the recipe of Russian success? Why it's still standing? It's been 4 years almost.
I don't think we can talk about Russian success. I think we can talk about Russia's ability to continue the war in the face of circumstances that are more difficult than they anticipated. That's quite a mouthful, but I think it captures it. There is a debate about sanctions, right? The Russians maintain the contradictory position that sanctions have no impact, they're in fact good for the Russian economy, but we want them all removed anyway. And there are both analysts who, for any variety of reason, and I'm not in any way impugning their integrity, just their judgment, who skew in the direction of, Russia's going to win this war, the sanctions aren't going to really stop them, and therefore, why do it? And there's quote-unquote sanctions scholars will say they can't be done. But as someone who's been pushing for sanctions, someone who knows something about sanctions but not a world-class expert, I can tell you my objective in pushing for sanctions was to increase the pressure on the Russian economy, knowing it would have an impact, but not expecting it to lead Putin to cry uncle. And if you look at the impact on GDP growth, what I expected turned out to be right, relying on people who understand sanctions better than I do. But again, Russia has 3 times, it's 3 times the size of Ukraine in terms of population. Its economy is much larger than that. Its geographic depth is much larger than that. So they have the ability to continue despite that. And so that's why, and because Putin truly wants this to happen, for reasons which are clearly not existential for Russia, but seem to be very important for him. Now, your second question?
Yeah, I'm kind of a futuristic person. I'm trying
That's
to...
right, that's right.
Yeah,
Russia
envision
that
the
emerges. Look, I can't speak for the administration. I can't speak for the president. It doesn't seem, and I say this as someone who watches them closely, but maybe not as closely as necessary, that promoting democracy is not large on their agenda. Traditionally, that has been a policy of the United States, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and you can even make the case before that. But they certainly want a Russia that is not working against American interests, a Russia with which they can cooperate. And that will be one factor in whatever follows Putin in the Kremlin, but not the only factor and not the most important factor. Russian domestic political circumstances will be the defining factor of what happens if and when this war ends and Russia loses this war. Discussing earlier, would Putin never be followed by a guy who would make him look like a very reasonable fellow? It's worth remembering that in the machinations surrounding the demise of Stalin, his most odious associate, Beria, the head of the, I guess it wasn't the KGB then, it was in the NKVD, was proposing détente with the West. So people who can be truly dreadful may recognize it's in their interest as they fight for power to argue for a much more reasonable or much less confrontational foreign policy. And Prigozhin demonstrated the fragility of Putin's regime, even though Putin survived Prigozhin, because Prigozhin decided to turn his troops around rather than head for Moscow. But Prigozhin said many different things. Some people would just point to one aspect of those comments and say, this guy is all in on the war in ways that Putin was not. He sounded like Strelkov, Yurkin Strelkov. But he also said things which clearly challenged Russia's interest or Putin's interest in launching the war. So we have no idea what would have happened had Prigozhin taken power.
Yeah, despite all the difficulties and sanctions, Putin keeps on fighting. Despite whatever Trump interests that he has, he's more interested, right, in the peace deal, win the Nobel Prize or whatever it is. You were saying, right, that there's certain things that the United States can do, right? More missiles, additional sanctions. Is it worth understanding what are the reasons why we don't go down that path?
Another good question. Look, Trump has his own way of looking at the world. He doesn't think geopolitically in the way that you might say a U.S. national security professional has been trained to think and who's learned to think as they work in the U.S. government. So things that seem natural to someone like me, it does not come naturally to the president. And again, he's the one who's the president. But there are certain points of reference he's have, which is why I have never been pessimistic that Trump would pursue policies that enable Putin to win. I won't say I'm overwhelmingly optimistic. I say the odds are 51 or 52% that Trump does what's necessary. But what he does will be slowly, at his pace. I mean, he made the strong step on sanctions this week and also on the nukes. But he also said somewhere in that our pressure on Russia should be calibrated. Well, no. If he really wants a faster peace, the pressure has to be constant and ongoing. But it's taken him a while to actually put pressure on. So it may be the second conclusion. And again, he's the guy who makes the shots because he's the guy who got the vote.
I'm going to take one more and then we're going to go drink. Because domestic politics came up, I want to read two more quotes. One of them is from me. One of them is from Ambassador Herbst. Both of them are from late 2021. And I won't say whose is who. And we agree completely. I think Russia is going to wind up heading in the right direction. There are people in the elite who understand, and there are more and more Russian people in general who will come to understand that this top-down approach, in which Russia feels the need to impose itself on its smaller neighbors, is going to prevent Russia from taking its place among the first nations of the world. When they understand that, they will head in the right direction, and I believe a successful Ukraine is going to be a powerful example for that. That was one of us. This is the other one of us. Every day that passes without a major escalation in the Donbass conflict, Ukraine takes one small step toward a European standard of living, while Russia and Belarus simply move 24 hours closer to their respective dictators' inevitable demise. As the Kremlin has long understood, the example of a free, prosperous, Western-oriented Ukraine is the transatlantic alliance's most powerful weapon in its struggle against post-Soviet autocracy. Eventually, the threat will find its way across the Russian border. I understood that, and you understood that. Did Putin understand that?
Of course not. That's the whole point. I've referred to a Russian think tank or a former hundreds of times at this point. And in that book, he brilliantly laid out in the first 60 or so pages Russian national security policy as it evolved from the Duchy of Muscovy in the 16th century through the end of the Soviet Union. And it was Russian domination, or Moscow's domination, or Moscow/St. Petersburg domination of its neighbors as a quote-unquote defensive policy. And Kissinger wrote famously, read his book, among others, Diplomacy, where he talks about the Russians since that period of time expanding, 120, 140 square kilometers every single day. But then Trenin writes, again, this is 22, 23 years ago, 24 years ago, that doesn't work to be a great power in today's world. And Russia has to give up imperial ambitions and focus on developing its economy, ensuring its citizens gain from its economic prosperity, and developing international partnerships. Former FSB guy wrote that years ago. Of course, 1 or 3 years after that, you had the Orange Revolution. He had to rewrite that book, basically pulling out the guts of his thesis. But the point is, he understood that 20 plus years ago. I'm confident he understands that today. It's just
Trenin or Putin?
Trenin. So I take him as an example of a think tanker who kind of understands how the modern world works and how Moscow needs to adjust, but he doesn't want to be outside the penumbra of Kremlin acceptability, so he sounds like a Neanderthal today. That's why, and it was clear which of those two were mine quotes, which one was yours. Mine was the first. It's clear there are people in Russia who understand this. And the examples I spoke of, this being Putin's war 45 minutes ago, all lend themselves to this interpretation. But Russia has to lose this war first for these things to happen. And while I think what I've just described is more likely than not, it's not fated to be the outcome. Things could go wrong. There's hundreds of years of autocracy in Russian political culture. The question is, can they walk away from that? And we've seen other countries walk away from, let's say, comparable, but not by no means identical traditions, when we won World War II. But then, of course, our defeated foes in World War II kind of accepted that they lost. And that was one unfortunate aspect of the end of the Cold War. But that unfortunate aspect, of course, undermines the Putin narrative that we shoved their defeat in their face, because we certainly did not.
Let's thank John Herbst for a wonderful discussion. Let's continue it outside.